Professor Friedman is professor of political economy at Harvard University, and he was formerly chairman of the Department of Economics here. And during his long and very productive career, he has authored dozens of articles, written and edited dozens of books, including such a masterpiece as The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. Professor Friedman, it's great that you are here, and I'm very happy to give floor. Yes, the floor is yours. Professor Friedman? Yes, hello.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon for you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to participate in this celebration of Smith's tercentenary. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have a few slides, and so if I may share my screen, I can put those up and proceed. Okay. Are you seeing some slides, I hope? Good, thank you. So the issue that I want to take up at Professor Maltsev's invitation is to think about intellectual origins and influences guiding Smith's thinking. I want to do that in three parts. First, I'd like to make sure that I'm clear about what I take to be the central contribution made by Smith. And then second, in the heart of my remarks, I will address what I think are four main influences on Adam Smith's thinking. And then finally, I'd like to say something about his lasting legacy, not only for our profession, but for the world at large. So first, in terms of Smith's contribution, it's useful to contrast economic thinking before and after Smith. And here I'm putting the word economic in quotation marks because there was no such word as economic at the time in our sense. Smith never thought of himself as an economist. He was a moral philosopher, as Professor Betke made very clear in his remarks, correctly so. I would summarize economic thinking before Adam Smith, say as of 1700, in terms of three very simple propositions. First, could individuals correctly perceive what it was in their self-interest to do in the economic sphere? And the answer was probably not. And this is the reason that most people at that time thought it was necessary to direct economic activity from a top-down direction. The French had their mercantilist system. The English had this elaborate system of government-granted monopolies, and other countries similarly thought that having economic activity be a top-down enterprise was important. Second question is, even if people could ferret out what was in their self-interest to do in the economic sphere, if they acted on that self-interest, there was no implication that their doing so made anybody other than themselves better off. So there was no sense of globally optimal outcomes following from private self-interested behavior. And third, for precisely that reason, the standard view was that action in the economic sphere motivated by individual self-interest was morally opprobrious. The standard adjective used was vicious. Standard noun was that this was a vice. If we come forward to 1790, and I pick 1790 simply because this is the year in which Adam Smith died, the three core presumptions are radically different. First, can individuals correctly perceive their self-interest in the economic sphere? Smith argued that mostly they could when they acted as producers. As I hope people are aware, Smith's writing, both in the Theory of Moral Sentiments and in The Wealth of Nations, is full of all sorts of scathing derision of the foolishness of individuals acting as consumers. But like a clever mathematician who doesn't want to assume anything more than he really needs to prove his theorem, Smith is aware that he doesn't need them to know what's in their self-interest in the consumer space. What is necessary is that they know what is in their self-interest when they act as producers, and for this purpose he assumes that mostly they do. Second, and I believe most importantly, Smith has the basic proposition that when individuals act on their own self-interest, they can, and under the right conditions will, and in a moment we'll come to what the right conditions are, make other people better off as well as themselves. This is, of course, the heart of what economists call the first fundamental welfare theorem, and it's a radical departure from what went before, and I think it's been the centerpiece of our analytical apparatus for the time ever since. And then third, again for this reason, by the time we get to The Wealth of Nations, actions motivated by individual self-interest in the economic sphere are no longer considered to be morally opprobrious. Now, to be clear, Smith did have intellectual predecessors, and I've listed here a few from the French and a few that were active in England before Smith's time. France is important because, as I hope people are aware, Smith lived in France for approximately 2.5 years, and it was while he was living in France that he began the project of writing The Wealth of Nations. And so I think the key question that we need to address right up front is whether these people, rather than Smith, deserve the credit for the creation of modern economics. Should we, for example, think of Bernard Mandeville as the father of modern economics, or perhaps Pierre Nicole? My answer is a very firm no. I believe we should not. And the reason is that even though people like Mandeville and Nicole and some of the others whom I had on the previous slide did intuit something like the first fundamental welfare theorem, they had no explanation whatsoever for how this result came about. Mandeville, for example, in his Fable of the Bees, perfectly well understood that it was, in his word, the vicious behavior of all of these bees that made the hive prosperous. And once they became virtuous, the hive collapsed. And similarly, Nicole had a marvelous essay from the 1670s, translated into English in the 1690s, laying out very clearly what in his language was the similarity between the results of actions driven by self-love and actions driven by charity. But they had no explanation for how this came about. They had no explicit awareness of the role of markets or competition in achieving this result. Now, we could say, okay, they didn't have our explanation. They didn't have Smith's explanation. Maybe they had some other explanation, but in fact they didn't. They had no other economic mechanism either. And hence, for a generation of intellectuals who are all trained to think in terms of Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism, I'll come back to that presently, this just wasn't going to fly. In effect, it was like being able to state a theorem but not even outline a proof. So let me be slightly more explicit now on Smith's argument in The Wealth of Nations. Step one is that the desire for material gain is inborn and therefore morally legitimate. Smith has this marvelous passage in The Wealth of Nations in which he says that the desire to improve our condition, as he puts it, comes with us from the womb and stays with us until the grave. And in between, there's scarcely a moment when it isn't acting on us. So this is no more morally opprobrious than the fact that we have to eat, we have to breathe. Now, one could, of course, in turn interpret the desire to improve our condition in many ways, but Smith goes on immediately to make clear that for the great majority of people, the way to do that is through their economic conditions. Second, how does the mechanism work? Smith is clear. This is the great contribution, I think, of The Wealth of Nations. At the center of the process is the role of competitively determined prices and wages. It's the competitive process that's his great piece of understanding, his insight. And third, he's sharp that these competitively determined prices and wages are the outcomes of bargains motivated by no more than self-interest on either side. As a result, competitive markets are an example of the standard Enlightenment idea of unintended and unforeseen consequences. The workers are simply seeking to get the maximum wage that they can get out of the bargain. The employers, the merchants, the producers are simply trying to get the labor for as little as they can. Nobody is either intending or foreseeing any public purpose. And then most important, this does lead to the first fundamental welfare theorem. It's the globally beneficial outcome of the private pursuit of individual self-interest when done under the right conditions. And so we now know that the right conditions is competition in markets. And this turns out to be beneficial for other individuals. That's the first fundamental welfare theorem. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith also has an argument about how this is beneficial for society. He didn't have the word externality, but it understood clearly what externality is about. And all this is what we understand today as the invisible hand idea. Now, importantly, this led to Smith's opposition in general to potential impediments to the competitive market mechanism. But, and here the but is very important, what impressed Smith consistently was the astonishing robustness of this result. Smith did not view the competitive market process as some kind of hothouse, delicate flower that needed to be protected against any conceivable encroachment. He thought it was a very robust process, and for this reason, Smith was very prepared to accept all sorts of restrictions when he thought they were needed for a public purpose. And I've listed on this slide just a few of the impediments, interference with the market process that Smith advocated in The Wealth of Nations. Things like progressive income taxes, luxury taxes. He wanted to have special taxes on luxury vehicles. He was in favor of restrictions on what and how people could build in cities. Whiskey, he was in favor of public education. He was in favor of more regulation, tighter regulation on banking than anything we have known in our lifetime, certainly in the Western world. I don't know what you've had in Russia. He was in favor of monopoly powers for central banks. And so many Americans in particular have the illusion that by opposing any conceivable interference with the market, they are echoing Smith. They are not. Smith was impressed not by the delicacy, but by the robustness of this mechanism. Now, let me turn to the central part of my remarks, and that's the question of what enabled Smith and in a limited way his predecessors too, but I really want to focus on Smith. What enabled Smith to reach this very important insight that created our discipline as a modern intellectual endeavor? I want to point briefly to 4 different influences that I think were of central importance in guiding Smith's thinking. The first of those was that Smith was a very observant man, and he lived in what was becoming an increasingly commercial society. During at various points in his life, Smith lived in 4 commercial centers. Starting in the top left, it's Edinburgh, where he came from and where he returned after his stay in France. In the upper right is Glasgow, where he was a student and where he was a professor. In the lower left is Paris, where he lived for 2 very informative years when he was just starting the process of writing the book. And then, of course, in the bottom right is London, where he spent much of his time after he came back from Paris. There was about a 10-year period before The Wealth of Nations emerged, and Smith spent much of that time writing the book not in Edinburgh but London. So he lived in a commercial world. His eyes were open. He approached it with great understanding. He mingled often with merchants and other people. And so I think this basic insight is there. This is well known, nothing original to me, and I don't think we need to dwell on it. Second, Smith, when he was an undergraduate at Glasgow, was exposed to Stoic philosophy. This is also well known. He and his friend and mentor Hume were very committed to the Stoics. The key principle that he took away that is of central importance for us is the Stoic idea of natural harmony in the universe. Smith's favorites among the Stoic philosophers were Epictetus on the left, Marcus Aurelius on the right. I think Stoic philosophy shows up in Smith's work in 2 different ways in the 2 different books. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the role of Stoic thinking appears first primarily at the individual level, in which, following Hume, it's all about the importance of introspection, tranquility, sociability, all of the issues that Professor Betke just articulated, in my view, exactly correctly. The Wealth of Nations, however, Smith now turns to the societal level, and now this natural harmony principle comes into play, and the whole concept of what we today call the first fundamental welfare theorem is indeed it's a very Stoic idea, the idea that if you do something that's in your interest, that somehow, through some mechanism, which we know to be competition in markets, your self-interested behavior makes me better off. Well, this is a kind of harmony that the Stoics didn't articulate, but that they perfectly well would have understood. Third, I want to come back to the idea that Smith lived in a generation of intellectuals, all of whom were thoroughly steeped in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. Newton's great book, the Principia Mathematica, had appeared in 1687. By the time Smith was an undergraduate in the 1730s, the book was used as part of the standard curriculum in all of the Scottish universities, also Cambridge in England. Interestingly, not at Oxford, and that's perhaps part of the reason why Oxford for so many years lagged behind in scientific endeavor. But these people were all trained in Newtonian ideas. They were all committed to notions of mechanism and system. Smith's mentor, Hume, had laid out the program back in the 1730s in his treatise. Here's a quotation from Smith in the treatise. He says that the idea is to develop a science of man. He says a complete system of the sciences for human nature, built on a new foundation. And what Hume is calling for in the treatise, and what I think he put Smith up to, and what Smith was trying to do, was to create a science of man comparable to what Newton had achieved for the physical sciences. And what is that all about? It's about conclusions that are drawn from first principles that are clearly either grounded in logic or based on observation. It's about causal mechanisms. Here again, the central role of the price mechanism. It's about situating those mechanisms within systemic laws of the harmonious universe. And this again gives rise to the importance of the first fundamental welfare theorem. And let me illustrate this notion. But here's a statement from, very familiar statement from The Wealth of Nations, about how the price system works. I'm not going to bother reading it, but let me give you just a moment to have a look at it on your own. And think about the language that Smith is using. And think about how Newtonian the language is, even in this very crucial part of The Wealth of Nations where he's articulating how the price mechanism works. Look at some of the phrases he's using. The prices are gravitating. The central, the market price. In our language today, the market price is gravitating toward the equilibrium market clearing price. Sometimes because of shocks, what he calls accidents, the market price is above the market clearing price, and it's suspended there, but then there's a force that drives it down, and so prices settle, and they're constantly tending toward the market clearing price. You know, if you read this language, Smith could be talking about planets orbiting around the sun, and he's, some astronomical accident knocks the planet out of the orbit. Well, there's something that we know we understand from Kepler and then Newton, why this comes right back. But he's not talking about planets. He's talking about market clearing prices, for goodness sake. But the whole point is it's very, very Newtonian. The last issue I want to put on the table is the one that I explored at great length in my recent book called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And that is that I believe Smith's thinking was powerfully influenced by the revolution that was going on in just the same time in the English-speaking world in the religious thinking of the English-speaking Protestant world. And let me be very explicit about what aspect of that revolution in religious thinking I think mattered. It was the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. Now, of course, there were many, many aspects, many dimensions of this religious movement, but I want to pick out three that matter for our purpose, one bearing on human nature, one bearing on human destiny, and one bearing on human purpose. So to take them in order, for purposes of human nature, Calvin taught that humans were totally depraved. Why? Because of the inheritance from the sin of Adam and Eve, as described in the second chapter of the Hebrew Bible. And in Calvin's terms, individuals, including all of us, are utterly indisposed to do any good. We can't even know what's good to do. And by contrast, The post-Calvinists thought that there is an inherent goodness in all individuals. Locke, for example, had this marvelous metaphor that we are all born with the candle of the Lord. What he meant by that is reason, and if we would only use the candle of the Lord, we could understand what we're supposed to do. That's a famous Locke metaphor. Second, in terms of human destiny, Calvin, this is the heart of predestination. Calvin thought that the central question for believers of who was to be saved and who was to be condemned was determined not only before each person was born, but according to Calvin, before the world was even created. So here's the famous Memling triptych, and to believers who worried if this is the judgment, and people who worried about whether they were going to wind up on the left side being shown into heaven by St. Peter, or on the right side going down to eternal torment. This was a crucial issue for believers, and the post-Calvinists thought that was wrong. They thought that everyone was potentially eligible to be saved, and moreover, that human choices and human actions matter. So the way John Tillotson put it, for example, Tillotson was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. The way Tillotson put it is that it's up to each individual to cooperate, is the way he put it, to cooperate with the divine in achieving his salvation. And then third, in terms of the human purpose, Calvin taught that the only reason humans are here is for the glorification of God. And by contrast, the post-Calvin, there's this great Calvin phrase in which the entire universe is, as he put it, a theater, his word, a theater of God's glory. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists thought that human happiness was certainly and perhaps the divinely intended purpose for our species. So if you put all these together, you have religious beliefs that are no longer anchored in concepts of depravity and predestination. You have a much more expansive and more optimistic view of human nature, and especially of the possibilities for human choice and human agency. And I think this was an important part of what was driving Smith and his contemporaries to realize that people acting on their own human nature, acting in their self-interest, could wind up taking actions that made other people better off as well. And importantly, this debate was at its height in Scotland, right at the time when Smith and Hume were young and coming into adulthood. This revolution I've described in this religious views of the English-speaking Protestant world was a kind of rolling phenomenon. It was at its height in England in the latter half of the 17th century. It hit Scotland in the middle of the 18th century. That's what important for Smith and Hume. And it got to my country in the latter half of the 18th century, which incidentally turned out to be very important for the foundation of the American Republic, but that's an entirely different story. Now, let me be very clear, just because I want to avoid misunderstanding. What I'm not suggesting is that any of this had anything to do with self-conscious intent by religiously committed individuals. We know that Hume was famously a skeptic. Most people in his day thought of him as an atheist. Smith had no known religious commitments himself. Most people think, and I do too, that he was at best a kind of 18th century deist, the kind of person that we in America would associate with, say, Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson. So what's the story then? How did all this work? I think it was, they were influenced for three reasons. One is that they lived in the religious thinking mattered to them because they lived in a world in which the religion was more central and more pervasive and more multidimensionally important than anything we know today. Intellectual life was much more integrated at that time. University faculties, Smith and Hume, were constantly mingling with their friends who were Church of Scotland clergymen. Their great friend William Robertson was the head of the church. And also keep in mind that these were issues over which people fought and men died. And so the 30 Years' War between the Catholics and the Protestants on the continent the century before, the English Civil War between two kinds of Protestants fought within the lifetime of Smith and Hume's grandparents, ongoing, the Jacobite Rebellion, all these uprisings in Scotland, some of which were right in, say, 1745, was right outside of Edinburgh. So they could not have helped but pay attention. And my view, which I've summarized in the book, is that all of this had to do with the Einstein view of the worldview. This was where their worldview came from. Einstein famously argued that scientific thought is a development of pre-scientific thought. And in another one of his papers, Einstein had this concept of the image of the world, in the original German, the Bild der Welt. And the Einstein idea is that the world is just too complicated. We can't make any progress if we try to analyze the world as it is. This is why we all tell our students that they may not like it, but they have to make simplifying assumptions, because without simplifying assumptions, there's no progress. Well, similarly, Einstein thought that each person has to create for himself or herself an image of the world, and then what the scientist does is to analyze not the world as it is, but the image of the world. That's what we economists do. We create models. Why do we create models with simplifying assumptions? Because the world is too complicated. And so instead what we do is we create a model, and then we analyze not the world, we analyze the model. Well, Einstein, interestingly, if you look at the statement, thought that this was not just what scientists do. And Einstein here mentions poets, he mentions painters, he mentions philosophers, and of course Smith was a philosopher. And Einstein doesn't particularly mention economists, but other people did. I think the Einstein idea is identical to what Schumpeter in the history of economic analysis meant by pre-analytic vision. Incidentally, that uppercase V on vision is not a typo. That's the way Schumpeter wrote it, with a capital V. And my colleague and dear friend, whom I miss very much, Ken Galbraith, wrote that economic ideas are always and intimately a product of their own time and place. Well, in all of these ways, both religious and otherwise, I think what Smith and Hume and their other contemporaries were doing was secularizing the dominant religious and other thinking, the Newtonian thinking of their time and their place. And I think the lasting legacy is that this view is still with us. Today, economics is still all about human choices. What do we teach in economics? The first semester of the subject is still all about the human choices made by individual households or firms. And then we go on to talk about their system-wide consequences. That's exactly what Smith was doing. And what is the centerpiece of our analytical apparatus for understanding how this works? It is exactly the competitive price mechanism that Smith outlined for us. I think the first fundamental welfare theorem still is the heart of our understanding of how a market economy works. And in a very deep sense, I think the kind of more expansive and optimistic view of human agency, of human nature, that Smith and Hume gave us are still ours as well. So that's what I had to say. I hope I've left a few moments for questions. And again, let me repeat my appreciation. I think it's wonderful that you're having a conference to mark the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith. I congratulate you for having the conference, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Professor Friedman. Probably I have even not a question, but some sort of very, very cautious suggestion. If Adam Smith was strongly influenced by religious ideas, and Smith is still strongly influencing modern economics, could we say that Western economic thought will continue its dominance in global academic world because it's probably difficult for economists from other cultural backgrounds to perceive the entire meaning of the key economic assumptions, probably?
Well, my sense is that economics is a very event-driven subject. And so the question I think you're really asking is whether the Western world will continue to be dominant
Maybe
in the
not
world
the world.
economy.
Yes.
If the Western world continues to be dominant in the way it has been for the last 500 years, then the Western economic thinking, I believe, will continue to be dominant in what our profession does. And by contrast, if we have some shift, so there are people who would argue that the day of the West is passing and that leadership in the world economy is going to pass, let's say, to the Chinese. If that were to turn out to be true, then my guess is that the economics of 100 years from now would be powerfully shaped by whatever different form of economic organization the Chinese evolved between now and then. So I think the answer to your question is not just an intellectual one, it's a one about the future of economic events.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Friedman. Thank you for your detailed answers. Yes, extremely interesting presentation. Yes, so we have one more question. Yes. Probably I will give you a microphone. Probably you could come closer. Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Friedman, for the interesting presentation. My question is, in some sense, philosophical. It's about the lack of the moral approach in the modern economics. Is there any necessity to return to the moral economics in present days, like it was in Adam Smith's times or before, in this, during the times of the School of Salamanca? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see I don't see much prospect for the introduction of self-conscious moral content in economics. I wrote a book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, but what I had in mind is more the Enlightenment idea that actions that people take for reasons that are not explicitly or self-consciously moral turn out to have moral consequences. And I think that's this is consistent with the Smith idea, what Hume had in mind. It's the notion of the systemic consequences of individual actions. Now, one could imagine and here going back to the Salamanca people, about which I want to be careful not to pretend to know more than I do, because my awareness of this is very, very much in passing. But my sense is that there was a long pre-modern period in which people tried to use economic thinking as a way to further the project of getting people to be, let's call it, better human beings, more morally driven individuals. And my sense is that went out with the Enlightenment. The famous phrase that I believe is due to Rousseau, but echoed by many others, is that the project is to study men as they are and the laws as they should be. That human nature is what it is. And I took that to be the exploration in the theory of moral sentiments. Smith was not trying to persuade people to adopt a different human nature than they had. He was taking human nature as what it was. Think about the very first sentence of the theory of moral sentiments. It just starts off, I'm not going to quote it exactly, but everybody's probably read it. He says, there are evidently some aspects of human nature that lead people to take an interest in the well-being of other people. And he goes on to talk about sympathy. He's not saying people should have sympathy. He's saying that they do. And moreover, he's very clear that it isn't his business to explain where that comes from. It's just an observation. It's just a given. And his whole discussion of the theory of the impartial spectator, praise versus praiseworthiness, all of this, he is taking human nature as it is. So I think as long as we are within the dominance of post-Enlightenment Western thinking, that's going to continue. We're going to take human nature as what it is. There is a whole industry of people who would like to make us better human beings. This is the clergy. That's a different enterprise. They're welcome to do that. I encourage them, but that's not what we're here for. And our activity is to analyze human nature as it is, and then to think through this in the economic sphere, because that's what we do, to think through the systemic consequences. And I think that's exactly what Smith was doing.
Thank you very much.
Professor Friedman, yes, thank you for your answers. Thank you for your participation. Yes, it's really a great honor and privilege for us. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Professor Böttke, yes, you're also here. Once again, many thanks for your participation. I think really enjoyed these wonderful presentations. Yes, they were truly insightful. And I think Adam Smith is happy, yes, that we're listening to such prominent scholars now. Thank you, dear colleagues. Yes, and I think now it's high time to start another session. Yes, and Professor Böttke, thank you. Professor Friedman, thanks. Thank